Daniel Cross never believed in the stories about his family's old farmhouse, and neither did his younger sister, Emily. But on their first night back inside those rotting walls, they woke to something impossible, faint whispers rising from beneath the floorboards. At first, it sounded like voices calling from far away, until the wood began to bend under unseen hands pressing upward. The first time I heard it, I was half asleep, floating somewhere between a dream and waking. A faint creak beneath me pulled me back into reality. So soft at first I thought it was just the usual noises an old house makes when it cools at night. But then it came again, sharper this time. A deliberate strain of wood, as if weight pressed down on the floorboards under my bed. My eyelids opened wide, and I froze. I told myself not to panic. Old houses breathe, they shift, they complain. But as I lay there, the noise didn't wander randomly the way settling should. It came in intervals. Pause, creok, slow, careful, measured, as if someone or something was moving in cautious steps directly beneath me. The blanket suddenly felt too thin to protect me. My breathing grew loud, ragged, so I clamped a hand over my mouth, listening. I didn't want to believe it, but the sound was unmistakable. Someone was down there. A trick of the imagination, I told myself. A dream bleeding into reality. But then the creaks stopped altogether, and a silence heavier than anything I had ever known pressed against my ears. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the thunder of my own heart. Relief began to trickle through me, and I almost closed my eyes again. That's when I heard it, the whisper. It wasn't coming from my room. It wasn't outside. It came from below, curling upward through the floorboards like smoke. At first it was faint, no more than a hushed vibration, impossible to make out as words. I held my breath, straining my ears, desperate to understand. The tone was low, almost soothing, but wrong. Not a voice I recognized, not a language I could follow. I pressed my ear against the mattress, closer to the floor, curiosity fighting terror. The sound sharpened the moment I leaned down. It wasn't just one voice. It was several, whispering together, overlapping, like a crowd murmuring in prayer. I jerked upright, heart slamming in my chest. The air felt heavy and damp, as though the whispers themselves were thickening it. The urge to run was overwhelming, but where would I go? If something was under the floor, wasn't the whole house part of it? I slid the blanket over my head instead, childish as it felt, suffocating beneath the heat. The voices didn't stop. They wove together in strange rhythmic waves, growing louder until I thought they might burst through the wood and fill the room. At some point, I must have passed out from exhaustion or fear, because the next thing I knew, sunlight was streaming in through the blinds. My room was bright, ordinary, harmless. Dust floated lazily in the warm light, and for a moment I felt stupid. I almost laughed. Houses make noises. Dreams spill over. My mind had tricked me. That was all. But when I swung my legs out of bed and pressed my feet to the floor, I felt it. Not a sound, not yet, but a tremor. A faint vibration in the boards, subtle, steady, like a pulse. My skin prickled as though the house itself was breathing beneath me. I pulled my feet up onto the bed and sat there for a long time, staring down at the wooden planks. Nothing moved. The room was silent except for the ticking of the clock on the wall. Eventually I forced myself to stand, telling myself it was my imagination again. Maybe the house sat on soft ground. Maybe pipes ran beneath it. I clung to every excuse I could conjure. The day passed without incident, but the thought lingered. I kept glancing at the floor whenever I crossed my room, waiting for something to stir. By the time night came, dread clung to me like a second skin. Still, I told myself I wouldn't give in. I refused to let a nightmare control me. I climbed into bed determined to stay awake, flashlight clutched in my hand. The house was quiet, the kind of stillness that feels endless. Hours crawled by. My eyes burned from straining in the dark. I started to believe nothing would happen at all, and then it began again. The vibration came first, rippling faintly through the mattress. Then the creaks, soft but deliberate, like steps moving directly beneath me. My grip on the flashlight tightened until my knuckles hurt. I wanted to shine the beam, but what good would it do if the noise came from under the floor? And then came the whispers. This time they were louder, clearer, closer. They rose up directly from the floorboards, not muffled or distant, but as though the voices were only inches from me, speaking through the cracks. They didn't sound like strangers. They didn't sound angry. They sounded urgent, desperate, begging to be heard. And they weren't alone. There were dozens of them, all whispering at once. The moment I heard the whispers swell beneath me, my whole body went rigid. I wanted to tell myself it was pipes or wind sneaking through cracks, anything but voices. Yet there was no mistaking the cadence, the rising and falling of sound, the urgent way they overlapped, as though whoever or whatever was below needed me to listen. I didn't. I bolted out of my room, slamming the door behind me. My heart thudded so violently it felt like it might split my ribs. For the rest of the night, I huddled on the couch, pulling a blanket around me like flimsy armor, flinching at every creak of the house. Eventually, the whispers faded into memory, leaving me wide-eyed in the suffocating dark until morning arrived. Daylight brought comfort. The house looked ordinary again, harmless. The kitchen smelled faintly of coffee grounds, the floor cool under my bare feet. For a while, I convinced myself I had exaggerated everything, but when I returned to my bedroom later I felt it. The air was colder there than anywhere else in the house. The sunlight that leaked through the blinds seemed dimmer, weaker, as if it couldn't fully push back the shadows. My stomach turned as I realized I didn't want to stay in that room anymore, so I avoided it. I kept myself downstairs, burying my mind in chores, television, anything that made noise. Hours slipped by, and I felt almost safe. But night has a way of stripping away lies. When I finally climbed the stairs, my body resisted, every step heavier than the last. My bedroom door loomed like the entrance to a cave. I told myself I would be brave, that I'd stay awake and prove nothing unusual was happening. I sat myself down on the floor with a flashlight, my back against the bed frame, staring at the wooden planks beneath me as if daring them to betray me again. The house was still for a long time, so quiet I could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. My eyes grew heavy, I shifted my weight, and the boards creaked under me. Then, in that fragile silence, I felt the vibration, subtle, like a shiver, spreading across the floor into my bones. I froze, breath caught in my throat. The whispering began again, thin and muffled, before swelling, louder than the night before. But this time, there was something new, a sound I had no way to explain. A faint scraping, like nails dragged across the underside of the wood. Long, deliberate, drawn-out scratches that made the hair on my arms rise. My flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam jittering across the floor. Then I saw it, dust-fine pale slivers drifting upward from between the cracks of the boards, stirred by some movement below. My chest tightened as though the air itself had thickened. I leaned closer despite myself, and that's when it happened. A shape pressed against the wood. Small at first, then clearer, the outline of a hand, long-fingered and skeletal, flattening against the underside of the plank. The wood bowed upward under the pressure, trembling as if something was straining to push through. My throat went dry, my legs screaming to move, but I couldn't look away. The fingers slid along the underside, leaving faint trails of dust in their wake. Then they retreated, vanishing into the darkness below. My stomach lurched and I scrambled backward, hitting the wall so hard the flashlight tumbled from my grip. The beam rolled across the floor, throwing warped shadows against the walls. I snatched the light back up, shining it wildly at the boards. But the hand was gone. Only silence remained, thick and suffocating, broken only by the blood rushing in my ears. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the entire thing, my brain desperate for sleep, conjuring shapes out of nothing. But then came the scratching again. Not at the center of the room this time, but by the door. Short, hurried scrapes, like claws dragging along the underside as it moved. I stumbled to my feet, lungs burning as I flung the door open and raced into the hallway. My legs nearly gave out as I pulled it shut behind me, pressing my weight against it as if that thin barrier would be enough to keep me safe. On the other side, the scratching grew louder, more insistent, moving in frantic bursts across the floorboards. It was following me, not blindly. It knew I had left. I staggered down the stairs, clutching the railing, each step trembling beneath my feet, as though the voices and the scratching were right beneath me no matter where I went. The house no longer felt like home. It felt like a trap, and I realized the awful truth. Whatever was beneath the floor was aware of me now, and it wasn't content to stay hidden anymore. For 2 nights I forced myself to sleep on the couch, refusing to step foot back into that room. The cushions sagged, the angle twisted my neck, but even with the discomfort, it still felt safer than lying above those whispers and that hand pressing against the wood. For the first time in days, I thought I had outsmarted whatever was under the floor. The 3rd night proved me wrong. I had just drifted off when a faint shudder passed through the couch, gentle enough at first to mistake for a dream. Then it came again stronger, pulsing up through the frame and into my ribs. My eyes snapped open, and I held my breath. The couch was trembling. Not a constant vibration, but a subtle rhythm, like something shifting directly beneath it. The blood drained from my face. I sat upright, clutching the blanket, straining to hear. That's when I caught it. Whispers, thin, deliberate, rising from the living room floor, coiling upward through the cushions. My heart slammed into my throat. They had followed me. The whispers grew louder, building into a low chorus that filled every inch of space. No words, just endless murmurs in a cadence that felt purposeful. My ears ached as though the sound was inside my head, pressing against the walls of my skull. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound burrowed deeper, vibrating through my bones. Then came the dragging noise, a rough, scraping movement across the underside of the boards, circling below me. The couch shifted slightly, sliding an inch across the floor, as though something had pressed upward against it. I stared, horrified, at the scrape mark it left behind. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. I jumped off the couch, backing into the corner of the room, flashlight shaking in my grip. The whispers swelled in volume as though excited by my fear. The boards beneath the couch quivered, dust sifting up from the cracks. My breathing was ragged, shallow. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the noise. It pressed against me, thick and expectant, like the pause before something terrible. My chest heaved, each breath loud in the stillness. For a long moment I thought maybe it had ended, that maybe I had imagined the shifting of the couch, the scraping beneath, and then the smell hit me. At first faint, then overwhelming, damp, earthy, suffocating. The smell of freshly dug soil, thick with decay. It filled the room, sinking into my nostrils, coating my tongue. I gagged, covering my mouth with a blanket, but it clung to the fabric, to my skin, to everything. I stumbled to the light switch and flicked it on. The room blazed with brightness, but instead of comfort, it only made the shadows sharper, darker in the corners. The couch sat crooked, not where I'd left it, the scrape mark visible on the wooden floor. My skin prickled with the undeniable truths. Something had pushed it from below. I couldn't bring myself to turn the lights off again. I sat in the corner until dawn, trembling, staring at the couch as though it might move on its own. When morning finally came, I walked into the kitchen on shaky legs, desperate for air, desperate for normalcy. But even there, the smell lingered. Later, when I returned to the living room in the pale light of day, I noticed something I had missed in the night. The rug beneath the coffee table was slightly raised at the corner, as though the floor beneath had shifted. I crouched down, pulling the rug aside, and found a crack running along the floorboard. Thin, jagged, fresh. Dirt clung to the edges of it, as though forced up from below. My heart stuttered. The whispers weren't confined to my bedroom anymore. They weren't limited to the upstairs floor. Whatever lived beneath the house was spreading, pushing upward, closer. I told myself I would leave, pack a bag, and never come back. But when I turned toward the front door, I froze. My shoes were already sitting there, just where I'd left them, but the laces were untied, dragged loosely across the mat, and the soles were coated in mud. I hadn't worn them in days. I couldn't shake the image of those muddy footprints. They had been faint, smeared across the mat by the door, as though someone or something had tried to walk in my shoes. I told myself I must have tracked in dirt before, that maybe I had forgotten. But the truth gnawed at me. I hadn't stepped outside in days. The mud wasn't mine. By then, the fear had rotted into something else, obsession. I couldn't live like this anymore, flinching at every sound, every shadow. I told myself that if I uncovered what was beneath the floor, I could end it. At least I would know. The not knowing was worse than anything. The plan felt solid in the daylight. The house was quiet then. No whispers, no vibrations. The silence tricked me into courage. I found an old crowbar in the garage, its metal head cold and heavy, and carried it upstairs to my bedroom. My hands trembled as I pressed the edge against a loose board near my bed. The wood resisted at first, groaning in protest, but with enough force it lifted. A rush of damp, sour air spilled out, making me gag. I dropped the board to the side and crouched low, shining a flashlight into the space beneath. My blood went cold. It wasn't the shallow crawl space I expected. Instead, there was a hollow cavity, wide and deep, dug out from the earth itself. The beam of my light revealed uneven dirt walls riddled with grooves and scratches. They weren't from tools, they were from fingers. Hands had clawed at that soil, tearing it apart until it formed a chamber. And scattered along the bottom were bones, small ones, large ones, shattered and incomplete. Some still had clumps of dirt clinging to them. The sight punched the air from my lungs, and I staggered backward. Then my flashlight flickered. For a split second, before it steadied again, I saw movement. A shape shifting deeper inside the hollow, just beyond the reach of light. Something pressed close to the dirt, curling away when illuminated. My skin prickled. I slammed the board back into place, hammering it shut with the crowbar, my breath ragged and panicked. That night, the whispers returned, stronger than ever. They weren't muffled now. They rattled through the walls, the floors, the ceiling, a chorus of voices rising in fury. They filled every room of the house, vibrating through the furniture, into my bones. I curled up on the couch, pressing my hands to my ears until they burned, but it was useless. Then, through the storm of voices, one separated itself, clearer, sharper, a single voice that cut through the others like a blade. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was speaking. It was saying my name. The sound of it froze me completely. It wasn't a stranger's voice, it was familiar. It was my own. My name repeated in a tone that mimicked me perfectly, rising from the boards beneath. My heart lurched violently. I stared down, shaking, unable to comprehend. The couch shuddered, sliding half an inch across the floor. A low groan of wood followed as if the entire foundation of the house had shifted. Then silence. I didn't sleep. I stayed awake until the pale light of dawn filtered through the blinds, feeling hollow, raw, drained. When the whispers finally faded, they left behind only one thing: a new smell. It wasn't just dirt anymore. It was rot, sweet and foul, like something long buried had been unearthed. In the morning, when I finally dared to enter my room again, I found something that made my blood run colder than the bones. On the wall above my bed, carved deep into the plaster, were words, not random scratches, but jagged, purposeful letters etched by desperate hands. 3 words: let us out. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the crowbar I'd left behind. My stomach twisted violently. They hadn't just been whispering nonsense. They had been pleading, begging to be freed, and now they had found a way to speak clearly. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I couldn't think, couldn't breathe without imagining hands clawing through the floorboards, breaking through the walls, dragging themselves into the light. Every sound made me flinch. Every creak felt like a warning. But as the sun set, I realized the most terrifying thing of all. The whispers hadn't been coming from beneath the floor anymore. They were inside the walls. I hadn't slept in days. My skin was pale, my eyes raw, but no matter how exhausted I became, sleep never came easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard them. The whispers were no longer buried beneath the floorboards. They were inside the walls, above the ceiling, rising from every corner of the house. There was no place left untouched. The walls breathed with their voices, their whispers threaded into every second of silence. At first I thought it was only at night, but then I began to notice them in the daylight too. Faint murmurs followed me as I washed dishes, as I climbed the stairs, even as I stood outside in the yard trying to escape. The whispers never left me. They bled into my mind, filling it with their noise until I could barely hear my own thoughts. The smell grew worse each day. That thick, earthy rot clung to everything, soaking into fabric, into my hair, into the skin of the house itself. I scrubbed the floors, opened every window, but the stench only grew stronger, heavier, as though the ground beneath me was splitting open to release it. I decided I couldn't stay. My body shook with a decision, but it was the only choice left. I packed a bag with trembling hands, shoving clothes inside, searching for my keys. My plan was simple: run, don't look back, don't think, just go. But when I reached the front door, my heart stopped. The chain lock was looped through, not in the position I had left it. The chain hung, twisted, bent in a way that didn't look natural. And at the bottom of the door, just visible against the wood, were marks, scratch marks, dozens of them, clawing upward from the inside. My stomach churned. The door hadn't been locked to keep anyone out. It had been locked to keep something in. I staggered back, my breath coming fast and uneven. That's when the lights flickered, once, twice. Then darkness swallowed the house whole. The whispers roared to life. No longer faint, no longer subtle, they screamed, overlapping, chaotic, vibrating through the floor and walls with such force that dust poured from the ceiling. I stumbled in the dark, flashlight shaking in my hands as I fumbled to turn it on. The beam flickered weakly, casting the room in trembling light. The boards beneath me buckled. The floor rose in uneven swells, groaning under pressure. Cracks split open, dirt pushing through like veins spreading across the wood. The voices weren't begging anymore. They were demanding, furious. I backed into the corner, eyes darting wildly across the room, and that's when I saw it. The wall beside the couch bulged outward, plaster cracking, chunks of paint flaking to the ground. It pulsed, swelling as if something inside was pressing against it. My legs refused to move. I watched in frozen horror as the plaster split wide open. A hand emerged. Thin, gray fingers like brittle twigs clawed their way into the light. Another hand followed. Then a face, pale, eyeless, with skin stretched too tightly over bone. Its mouth opened, releasing a hiss that wasn't a sound but 1,000 whispers spilling out at once. I screamed and dropped the flashlight. The beam spun across the room, landing on the opposite wall, just as another crack split wide. Another hand pushed through, and then another, behind me, above me, beneath me. They were everywhere, forcing their way inside, peeling themselves from the house as if they had always been a part of it. The air turned suffocating, heavy with soil and rot, my lungs straining with each desperate breath. I bolted for the stairs, slipping, scraping my knees, but I didn't care. I had to get out. I had to reach the door. My heart thundered so loud it drowned the screams in my ears. But when I reached the front hallway, I froze. The door was open, wide open, yawning into the night. Cool air spilled inside, carrying the scent of wet earth. Relief surged through me until I saw what lay just beyond the threshold. Footprints, dozens of them, leading out into the dark, bare, misshapen, sinking deep into the soil as if many bodies had dragged themselves free. My eyes followed the trail until it vanished into the woods beyond the yard. The whispers didn't fade. They surrounded me, inside and outside, all at once. I turned back to the house, shaking, trying to convince myself I had imagined it all. But there, on the wall by the stairs, carved into the plaster in jagged, uneven letters, were new words. Fresh. "We are already out." The voices swelled so loudly I dropped to my knees, clutching my head, screaming into the dark. But the truth pressed down on me, undeniable. The floor hadn't been the prison. The house hadn't been the prison. I wasn't sure how much longer I would remain myself before their voices swallowed me completely.